Hey economists! Exciting news! Global Forecasting School is hosting exclusive bootcamps in gorgeous Algarve, Portugal. Picture this. May 6th to 31st and June 3 to 28th. Learning surrounded by stunning landscapes of Algarve. This time, we are specializing in non-traded sticky price and not the fat pill book for our new GFS students. It's an unforgettable learning experience. I've been there, trust me, it's incredible. Next stop, the Dilijan Research and Training Center in Armenia, my hometown. A place where ancient history meets modern education. Join our summer school from July 1st to August 30th for a dynamic learning environment. Develop key technical skills, enhance your research abilities, and receive mentorship from the best in the field. Improve communication skills in an environment all about continuous learning. Don't miss out on these incredible opportunities. Hit the link below to learn and apply. Your future in macroeconomics awaits. Seize the chance to shape your future with Global Forecasting School.
The screen.
Yeah, so let me talk first and introduce you, okay? So first thing, non-traded sticky prices, we started in Armenia. And I think if you go back to the beginning of the roots of the project, it took about 3 years to go from kind of thinking about the issues to actually implementing something and so on. Here I have to, there. So I'm just letting somebody in. Okay, so it took about 3 years. And then, of course, we then did it in Georgia. I don't know, maybe in a month, a little bit more than a month, and so on. But more importantly, now we think we can do it much faster on other countries because of the better understanding what it is that we're dealing with, and then using our experiences of Georgia, Armenia, which are on kind of one end of the spectrum, in the sense that there are economies that still have what we describe as either implicit or explicit indexation. I like to say sometimes maybe a little bit of excessive dollarization, where people are constantly concerned about what I would describe as the exchange rate, inflation, monetary policy nexus. And that's just a concern that feeds into the country risk premium and so on. Sorry, there's somebody having a problem getting in, and she's important. And so what we're going to do here is turn it over to Sergi. It's been kind of fun in the sense that in going through the drafts of this paper, we are constantly trying to improve the language of what it is we're doing, okay, and what is the essence of the argument. And so poor Sergi has drawn the straw for trying to explain what we're trying to do as intelligibly as we can as of February 8th, 2024. So Sergi, please go ahead and explain what it is you think you've done and so on.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the introduction and also having me in this seminar to present our research. So like as Doug already mentioned, my name is Sergi Gadelia and I'm working the National Bank of Georgia. So in this presentation, what I would like to discuss is our latest research that we were doing at the National Bank of Georgia. And our research was mainly concerned with to develop the new measure for this monetary policy analysis, or I would rather say to come up with the new approach to have these underlying indicators for the monetary policy. And our team at National Bank of Georgia has been working quite extensively about the last 2 months, if I'm not mistaken, to develop this measure. And actually, I would like to highlight this excessive effort that my colleagues, Tanta, Mariam, and Anna put in drafting this paper and finalizing the results when we were at the Dilijan. The aim of our research actually was to, again, first of all, we had like two main aim. One is more broad and is to question this common practice of excluding the volatile items from the consumer price index and use it as a underlying inflation measure for monetary policy. And it's well known, this core CPI approach. And what we do here, you use this novel methodology that divides this CPI into two very critical components, and they both will play like a crucial role in the analysis of monetary policy. And these two categories are the flexible prices and non-tradable sticky prices. In this, for this methodology and for this research, we draw our inspirations from, first of all, the Atlanta Fed's sticky price inflation measure, and also from the work of the Central Bank of Armenia regarding these non-tradable sticky prices. Before I present you our results, what we got during this research, let me actually talk about a little bit about the motivation or the broader picture. So what led us to start developing this measure and why it's really important for the policy making. So here we should remember and what is the objective of the National Bank of Georgia, or in general, what is the objective of any central bank? And in our case, it's to anchor the economy to this 3% inflation in our case. And how do we anchor the economy? Well, under this inflation forecast targeting regime that we practice at National Bank of Georgia, this monetary policy is like much more than just simply setting this current policy rate at each decision day. It's more like a decision which is followed by this expected policy path. This policy path needs to be consistent with our 3% inflation target. However, there are many different shocks that may hit the economy, and it could actually prolong this process of achieving the 3% inflation target. And the economy stays anchored as much as our outlook on the economy is consistent with our outlook on the policy rate path. In order for the NBG to achieve its objective and also to have these appropriate policy measures or conduct these appropriate policy actions, let's say, and it's not only about our case, but it's for almost all forward-looking inflation targeting central banks, and especially those that implement this forecasting and policy analysis system. All the central banks, including us, need to answer like three, I would say, critical and essential questions to conduct a proper analysis and have the proper policy measures. And these questions, I guess you have seen it millions of times, but it's really important. And again, I will repeat myself, it's critical to answer these questions. And these questions are like, first, where is economy now? Which entails this current analysis or understanding the current trends in the economy. And the second question, which is highly interlinked with the first one, is what are the underlying forces that are driving and these current threats in the economy? And the final, I would say, most important question is, what do we need to do with our policy instruments? Or how we need to change our policy instruments to achieve our primary objectives? And to answer the third question, or to again conduct this proper policy, we essentially need to have questions for the first two. So
it seems to be, the screen seems to be stuck. Like it looks like on my screen it looks weird. It's like you haven't engaged PowerPoint.
Let me correct.
But
hi everyone. Yes, I
hey.
think you need to show the full screen.
You arrived just in time, Shalva. Thank you.
So is it moving now?
It's good now.
Okay. So like usually, like all these FPAS central banks have some underlying inflation measure in order to track these price dynamics, and also to have signals when the policy intervention is actually necessary. And this the National Bank of Georgia, for example, uses currently headline as well as core CPI to do this. But there are important drawbacks associated with these measures from this methodological point of view. First of all, the headline CPI is an aggregate measure, and it looks at overall price dynamics. Therefore, it's really hard to disentangle these driving forces behind it, and whether the policy response is required or not to deduce this. And usual approach, again, taken by many central banks, which currently also includes the NBG, is to look at this core inflation measure. And the main purpose of this core inflation is to mainly exclude some volatile items from the CPI basket, with the very noble goal to capture more slow-moving prices. But however, this core inflation still incorporates the significant share of goods and services, which are quite vulnerable to these frequent price changes, as well as some external shocks, and which might not be directly related to monetary policy. And it makes it really difficult to tell economic narrative about the policy given this measure. And to illustrate these difficulties, on this graph, we present the monetary policy rate and the core inflation since early 2011. And these issues I've mentioned is clearly visible here. Namely, the inconsistencies usually arise. Actually, these inconsistencies between the policy behavior and the core inflation mainly arise during these large shocks, when we have a very critical need to have the proper underlying inflation measure. For example, in 2011, the National Bank of Georgia actually tightened its monetary policy to fight the high inflation. But at the time, the core inflation was remaining quite low, in big part due to this strong exchange rate that we had back then. And the second example, very similar, could be attributed to this COVID-19 pandemic period, when this core inflation remained elevated because we had very sharp exchange rate depreciation, and that led to increase in the tradable prices. But the monetary policy was, in contrast, eased, because inflation was considered as a transitory, or mainly driven by the external shocks, and which should have been, as I mentioned, transitory. Therefore, given that lockdowns were considered a temporary measure, and also the long-term expectations were anchored, this loose monetary policy was initiated to support the economic activity. And the final episode could be attributed to this 2023, when core inflation started to decline sharply and was below target in the latest period of 2023. But the bank actually may still maintain the tight policy, stance, and the intuition behind this action was that we still had some elevated underlying inflation, and inflation expectations were also disanchored from the target after these 2 years of consecutive very double-digit headline inflation. Therefore, there was a need to have more careful policy to anchor the economy. So, from this discussion, it's evident that the use of core inflation and an underlying inflation measure has lots of drawbacks, and we need to be careful with this. Therefore, in our research, what we do, we propose this new decomposition that should better capture this slow-moving prices or infrequently adjusted prices. And one could ask, why do we need the additional measure, or why this specific dichotomy, especially, well, in this case, this flexible division of the CPI basket into flexible and sticky is really relevant. Well, the main advantage of this decomposition is that it's done, first of all, in a broad sense, actually thinking about this economic logic behind the movement of different prices, because these flexible prices actually respond to current market conditions, and namely these generalized excess demand conditions, as well as some external shocks and exchange rate movements, and they are really quick to adjust. So a good example of this kind of prices could be the energy prices like gasoline, or any commodities like potatoes, wheat, and etc. These flexible prices actually also contain very important information for us. Therefore, in our methodology, we don't think of throwing out stuff out of CPI basket. Rather, we think about decomposition. And these flexible prices, in that sense, serve as a good early warning signals for the policymakers regarding whether these inflation expectations could become de-anchored. And on the other hand, we can also think about the fact that these commodities are really critical production inputs, and they can have spillovers over this stickier part of the economy. And that's the part where the monetary policy is more relevant or can have an effect. Under the sticky prices, we mainly consider, again, as the name suggests, the slower moving prices. And we look at this because the sticky prices actually incorporate these forward-looking expectations regarding inflation. And the reason or the intuition behind why it's so is that the price setters who change prices infrequently, first of all, they perceive these frequent changes as costly. And secondly, because they change them infrequently or have it fixed for some period, they need and actually tend to incorporate the expectations regarding this future in the prices and in their pricing decisions, in other words, because they cannot adjust them quickly in case of need. These sticky prices are good proxy for the inflation expectations, these medium and long-term inflation expectations, and they really offer these unique insights for the policymakers because they reflect, again, these long-term forces that influence the inflation. A bit of the methodology, like in order to categorize the goods into the sticky and flexible categories, as a benchmark, we employ this Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's methodology, which is based on this Bills and Klinoff's micro study, as well as Brian Mayer's paper. What this methodology in a nutshell entails is that the frequency of price adjustments are observed for each specific good and service. And then there is a threshold below which the commodities or goods are regarded as or the CPI categories are regarded as flexible, while above the threshold, these categories are regarded as stickier. And in this specific Atlanta-Fed's case, because it's tailored for the US, these flexible prices consists of around 30% of the overall basket, and mainly include this food, energy, and other commodities, while the rest are categorized under the sticky prices, and they consist of 70% of the total CPI basket. But of course, this methodology serves as a good benchmark for us. But when actually developing this kind of measures, one needs to also consider the specific features of the specific economy they're considering. And in case of Georgia, we are the small open economy who also face this excessive financial dollarization. And in the monetary policy transmission, respectively, the exchange rate channel and general exchange rate plays a really crucial or important role. And in these dollarized economies, in addition, some sticky prices are still affected by the exchange rate movements. So in order to account for these exchange rate movements, we need to have the further categorization of CPI. And what we suggest is to decompose the CPI into non-traded sticky prices, and the rest of the categories are accumulated into these flexible prices. So we call this flexible. And this flexible, of course, includes some traded as well as non-traded goods, and mainly these non-traded goods which move more, prices of which move more frequently. So this non-traded sticky price inflation measure, we can say that it's more in line with this central bank mandate. And the thing is that in the well-anchored economy, these non-traded prices are not expected to be affected much by the exchange rate movements and external shocks. Of course, because we are dollarized, they still respond to this exchange rate fluctuation. So it's just a disclaimer that we should not think of the non-traded sticky prices such a way that they are totally not affected by these exchange rates. Rather, they are also influenced by the exchange rate. It's crucial to highlight that. And so, given all these above mentioned points, it's, I guess, straightforward to think that this non-traded sticky prices consists of the smaller percentage of this overall CPI basket of Georgia. It's around 30%. And it's actually good because we want to have a measure that has these forward-looking qualities and also closely tracks these medium-term as well as these long-term inflation expectations. And also we want to somehow give us an idea of how well the central bank is providing the nominal anchor to the economy. Just as an illustrative example, how this decomposition and especially this measure actually can help in the policy making, we can consider this current situation in the Middle East. So as we know, due to this ongoing conflict, there are expectations of higher oil prices, and as well as there are some disruptions of the supply chains, mainly through this Suez Canal. And this could imply that prices on the international commodity markets could rise following these problems. And if policymakers actually fail to adequately respond to these early warning signals that could be reflected in the flexible prices, first of all, especially when there are some generalized excess demand conditions, there is a high risk that these inflationary pressures will spread to the stickier segment of the economy, like this wages or the service inflation, and this could then require a much more aggressive policy adjustment to the disinflate economy, and this will in the end cause this unnecessary harm to the real economy. And so this risk is materializing, that will call for this tighter policy even now, and this can be understood by looking exactly at this non-tradable sticky price inflation that reflects these long-term inflation expectations. So now I turn to our results of the paper after we developed this measure. So we applied this measure to explain this historical narrative behind the dynamics of the inflation, and it proved to be really useful to explain both the inflation dynamics as well as their respective policy response for the past decade. But for the illustrative purposes, I'm going to concentrate specifically on this COVID-19 period and period afterwards, when we had this prolonged period of double-digit inflation. So we all know that during this COVID-19 lockdown, there was the significant disruptions in the supply chains that and the supply side pressures were reflected on the international market. But after this lockdown actually eased, the economy started to rebound after this downturn, and this rapid recovery of the economic activity was first of all driven by this pent-up demand, and was also combined with this increased commodity prices due to these supply side pressures that I already mentioned, namely this elevated international transportation costs, etc. And it really played a significant role in the growth or the upward trend of these traded flexible prices. So this inflation surge actually presented to be a real challenge, and it highlighted the risks that it could destabilize these long-term inflation expectations. And as a result, the subsequent shocks and persistently high prices extended to more stickier sectors of the economy, and we can observe that this non-traded sticky price inflation measure started to also increase in the especially after in the second half of the 2021. And in other words, it was spilled to the stickier part of the economy and caused this large increase in the wages and also the service prices. And to counter these inflationary pressures, the National Bank of Georgia actually took a very proactive approach, let's say. So it initiated this monetary policy tightening, and this tightening was well ahead of some advanced economy central banks. And the stance and these proactive actions, first of all, demonstrated that NBG was committed to address and manage the risks, and also it was ready to anchor, do everything to anchor the economy back to this 3% inflation target. And as a result, from 2021 to early 2022, this cumulative increase in the policy rate amounted around 3 percentage points and reached these 11%. But after this economy was anticipating the return to normal state with this pressure fading away, there was another huge global shock, this Russian invasion in Ukraine, and this further disrupted this normalization trajectory. And this event led to quite a large surge in the international commodity prices again, and it impacted Georgia as an importer of these goods. But on the other hand, it had the another effect on Georgia, and it was connected to these migration flows. So migration from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus increased significantly, and it contributed to substantial rise in this Georgian aggregate demand. And it further exacerbated these inflationary pressures. But in the later part of the 2022, the exchange rates start to appreciate, and also on the international market, the normalization started, and commodity prices started to decline, and therefore this flexible inflation started to sharply decline also. And also around March of 2023, it was below 3% target, this overall headline also. But despite these very positive developments, the non-tradable sticky price inflation remained still elevated above target, and it still remains around 4% in the December of 2023. That could indicate that this long-term or medium-term inflation expectations are still disanchored. So there is a need for tighter policy for a longer period to actually anchor the expectations. And the National Bank of Georgia responded accordingly. It's implemented this slower reduction in the monetary policy rate than was expected initially, and due to this below target headline inflation. And the tight monetary policy stance, well, its aim is to, again, as I mentioned already, to anchor inflation expectations back to the target. So just to sum up this point, this non-tradable sticky price inflation measure reflected very well this rationale behind the current policy stance of the MBG, as well as historically the rationale behind the actions of the National Bank of Georgia in general. And as a last part of this discussion, just to illustrate again the usefulness and relevance of this new measure, we can consider the credibility computed based on this non-traded sticky price inflation measure, and how it's related to these monetary policy rate decisions. Well, first of all, we all know that the formation of these expectations is very closely tied to the credibility of the monetary policy. And as this figure actually shows and illustrates, there's a clear link. In other words, our simple measure of credibility that we have based on this new non-traded sticky price inflation measure was low during when the then the policy rate was kept high, and the opposite. So in other words, this correlation between these two is really high, and this means that the credibility that can very easily be computed using our inflation measure has captured really well all this diverse information and also judgments that were incorporated in these monetary policy decisions. So just to sum up in general, this non-traded sticky price inflation and credibility measure based on it provides very good simple benchmark against which our policy can be judged. So this was all regarding our research. Thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions.
Doug, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Sergi. This is a question I asked Anna. Okay. And actually, she gave me an answer, but I was curious what your answer is, whether or not it's the same answer as she gave me. It's also a good answer. It's a good question for Miriam, because they're the ones that have written the R programs to analyze the data and so on. So when we start off with the Atlanta Fed, it's based on a micro study where you select what you think are prices that are set infrequently, typically, let me emphasize that, okay? And then from that, you just take the CBI basket and then pick those items once they've been classified. But when you think about that, once you understand the behavioral differences between prices that are frequently set versus prices that are set infrequently, okay? And you have some idea about what is tradable and non-tradable. What it means is that we can use the behavior because we've trained the sample with Armenia, Georgia, and the United States, and which means that we can actually, once we get the data for a basket of the CPI, in other words, we get the weights and we actually get the data. So I asked Anna, how many countries could we do in a year? Now that we know that, we just have to figure out which ones to select, and we don't necessarily have to have a micro study for each country, right? Because we can infer from the implications. Now, let me just explain the difference between our concept and a statistician. So in an environment that is inflationary, flexible prices will move first. It's true in the US, true in Armenia, true in Georgia, true everywhere, because of the very nature of the idea that some prices are set they're set in frequently, like for example, haircuts in economies that are anchored really well, or the price of rent, a rental unit. I noticed that in the numbers that you presented, Sergi, housing almost doesn't exist, and so you have to realize that some of your numbers are simply because you're not considering housing, like usually the weight of housing is a really big number in the CPI. Your category is like 5%. That just must include some small little thing relating to housing repairs or something, but I don't understand that. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that a statistician would be throwing out volatile items. And when you're in an inflationary environment and the people get a chance to reset the price of their rent, they're going to raise it a lot. and the statistician is going to throw that out because somehow it's volatile. So obviously, statistical criteria like volatility and stuff like that. The other thing that's really fascinating that I was hoping you'd talk about is when you aggregate over a bunch of prices that are set infrequently, there's going to be some of those prices that are overlapping. Okay, so that also accounts for the smoothness in the in the series that you get, that you seem to like, because you can tell a story. So my question is, same question as I did to Anna. How many countries do you think you can do in a year now, given how long it took you to do this? Because we went from 3 years to 2 months. How much for the next country? How long would it take once you had the basket?
I mean, it depends on the number of people that are doing this, I guess. But I don't know. I think maybe 6 countries or 7 countries could be feasible. Depends on the time committed to it and number of people that are doing it.
This is a very big part of the project on what we call macro term premium. Okay. But then there's another project on the Orphanides rule, okay, which is to think about a benchmark rule. So if you could come up with much more practical real-time measures of inflation, that would be helpful for both what Sergi has illustrated today in terms of improving your understanding of how the economy works and how the transmission mechanism works, and making it easier to communicate monetary policy and so on, because it does improve your understanding. Shalva, any words, or Tamta? We struggled with this whole language
Yes.
of throwing stuff out. Like I've been the anti, I've been the guy saying stop talking about throwing stuff out of the CPI. But what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation is that we're trying to motivate why one should use these sticky prices and why one should not be just throwing stuff out. But if you think about it, like theoretically from a standard macroeconomic models, what needs to be defended and which will be very difficult to defend is why people not use sticky prices. like take standard New Keynesian DSG models. The reason why inflation is forward-looking in those models is because in those models, the only inflation measure they have is sticky price inflation. Why monetary policy has real effects in those models? It's because in those models, all the prices that are incorporated into the model are sticky prices. Why it's optimal to have like a kind of an inflation targeting in this kind of models? It's because prices are sticky. So we have this kind of a macro models, even standard TSG models. All they know is sticky prices, and yet in the real world, data counterpart to this is not very much used. So it's like a from a theoretical point of view, it's pretty clear why this kind of measure is useful. Maybe it seems challenging to build such a measure, but thanks to Atlanta Fed, we have some kind of a benchmark. And once you have this benchmark and more like an expert knowledge of what to think about each sector within an economy, then it seems that our experience is not it's not very difficult to come up with such a measure that has economic meaning. So I think it's feasible to apply this to other countries. It's very interesting that once we applied this to Georgia, it gave very reasonable results, and actually it provided a more accurate understanding of monetary policy decisions that I initially expected. This simple measure of credibility, which we based on non-traded sticky price inflation, gave almost a perfect explanation for policy rate decisions. It's as if one would think there is some kind of a deception in measuring and in building this credibility measure. But of course, this is like a simple approach that has been around for quite a while. So no funny business. It just seems that it captures these policy decisions quite well. So it's encouraging and also theoretically sound. And I think this is quite a useful and policy relevant and important area of work.
Yeah, I would like to congratulate you guys for doing it. Tamta, do you have any do you have any views
Yeah,
about all this?
I also relate to Shalva's point, and it's good for policy making point of view, because when policymakers are throwing some stuff and are looking core inflation or are measuring inflation, excluding some factors, this is like the excuse for policymakers if they will not guide the monetary policy in an adequate way, if they would not change monetary policy instruments sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation expectation. It's like the excuse for the policymakers that we are looking at some stuff, we exclude some stuff and throw it away, and so it will guide bad decision for monetary policy making of view. And this simple measure shows very good way the inflation development and gives us the story behind the statistical numbers. It's not statistic, it's rather than the economic story behind these measures. And so the it will help policymakers to make decisions sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation expectation.
And by the way, I just remembered that one model that I actually studied in my graduate studies was Gallian Monacelli DSG model, which goes one step further in enriching like a standard closed economy DSG model. And in this paper, when they kind of extend this closed economy model into an open economy one, they have two types of prices in this model. So one is imported prices, which fully depends on exchange rate. That's kind of a flexible price counterpart. And the other is domestic inflation, what they call, which is like a sticky price counterpart, because domestic inflation in their model is fully capturing only those prices that are set by producers infrequently. And they show that optimal policy in this kind of model is stabilizing domestic inflation, which is like exactly 100% sticky prices. So given this kind of already well-established results in this kind of models, it makes sense to actually take seriously this project.
Yeah, this is all has high CAS because on this is an important foundational building block for these monthly models we're developing. And both HiCAS and Sergi are leading the charge to coordinate the development. Just to give you an idea, why is this such a good idea? Well, Sergi talked about the historical narrative for Georgia. And telling that story about the historical narrative is much easier to talk about monthly data than quarterly data, which are like moving averages. Like, the global financial crisis started on September 15th, 2008, 15 days before the end of the quarter. So like when we talk about things like arbitrage conditions and stuff like that, like term premium and so on, it's very problematic to think about quarterly data. And so we have to think higher frequency if we want to take seriously macro financial linkages, so that we have this whole project called macro term premium research that will be supported by the development of these better measures of inflation, because as Sergi and Shalva said, and as is true in Armenia, that you get a much better historical narrative about what's going on in the economy by looking at both flexible and prices that are set infrequently and non-traded and policy. So HiCAS doesn't look like he's lighting up. Maybe Sergi can say a few words about the agenda for both the monthly two-country versions of those models, what countries are our primary interest and so on, because we want to understand term premium from a macro perspective, and the monthly projection model, global. So it took with I would say the kind of resources that we have here, less than a year to build the quarterly projection model, effectively using Bayesian methods to impose sensible economic causality on the data. So how long will it take us to develop Sergi and HiCAS if he's available? But Sergi is supposed to be ready to answer this question. How long will it take to develop the global version of the monthly projection model, where we'll have something to look at things like the financial market in the US and Euro area, and be able to link it to all kinds of information that's released in financial markets and the real economy. So Sergi, how long?
Yes, like so far, what we discussed, I think it could, like what me and HiCAS discussed, it could take around half a year maybe, or a bit less, to actually have some like first draft or these models. And we want to, as we also discussed previously in the Dilijan, we want to incorporate the US, Euro area, Japan, China, and also we are thinking to have like Armenia and Georgia and these models.
Okay, so 6 months, is that your answer?
Yes.
Okay, that will be interesting. HiCAS is not saying anything. So he moved. But
I'm here.
did I wake you up? Sorry.
Yeah, that's I agree with Sergi. 6 months is fine, but if we can kind of extend our community within other central banks and other institutions, so they can integrate, let's say, their parts. If we can, for example, work with Colombians and they can integrate Latin American bloc into the model, it will be much more nice. Yeah, it depends, but the general parts of the model, as Sergi said, like the big blocks, US, EU, Japan, China commodities, and because we are interested in Armenia and Georgia, so we can have small open economies for them. And then if we extend our community, we can integrate much more countries and blocks into the global projection model.
So basically, in what it means is that we'll have a structure, okay, that we'll just be able to think of, as working for a certain taxonomy of countries like advanced and so on, and then have a structure that deals with the issues of emerging markets and low income. So if we have it all in our mind, we just have to, and we've done the calculations to check if it's all feasible to do a monthly frequency, but it'll just be much easier to do economics, like to do the historical narrative and talk about the real world and deal with all these technical issues of moving averages that you get into when you work with a quarterly model. And we've also tested, you lose nothing. Like in other words, when you look at the dynamics and so on of the model, you would say that you've lost any information. You're just thinking more clearly about things, and that should raise productivity. Now, it does increase computational time, allowing you to have more time to think about stuff while the computer is running. And so that is another added advantage. Okay, so thank you very much, Sergi. Any other questions? Jared, Tamta, Leah, Patricia, any questions? No? Okay, so hi, Yorgi. Okay, so we'll see you. Thanks. Very good, Sergi. Very nice presentation.
Bye.